So I love to tell this story of the weeds and the wheat because it reminds me of something I need constant reminders of. It's not all up to me. One summer I was a hospital chaplain. Well, not a full chaplain. It was an internship while I was at seminary. I was 22 years old and I had not spent much time in hospitals. I was the chaplain on call, and it was the middle of the night when the pager went off. It was the NICU, the neonatal infant care unit. There I met a young woman not much older than I was at the time. She had just lost her newborn baby boy. This tiny baby boy was only a few hours old, and she now sat beside him, tears running down her face. I introduced myself, told her I was the chaplain, and I prayed for her, and then we talked. Well, that's not true. The truth is I talked. I was uncomfortable with the situation, uncomfortable with the silence, and so I talked, thinking somehow my words could fix this. I talked until this broken-hearted mother looked up at me and asked very gently, "Would you mind if we just didn't talk?" It was a terrible situation. I desperately wanted to help, and I was so confident that if I could just find the right words, I could make it better. I'm glad I'm not still that naive. Well, that's also not true. Sometimes I still try to make everything better, as if my words or my work can fix any situation. I know it can't, but I sometimes still naively try. Do you ever find yourself doing that? If you like, you can think of Matthew as a preacher who preaches to a congregation like ourselves. Matthew's congregation had their own pain, their own disappointments. They were convinced that Jesus was the long-promised Messiah of Judaism, the one who would establish God's ways in the world. They were convinced that Jesus was infused with the Spirit of God in a way that no one else had ever been. And yet, rather than redemption and healing and abundant life being the norm, the world was still a mess. Do you ever feel that way? They professed that Jesus was Lord, but from all objective measures, Caesar still seemed to be calling the shots. And they practiced a new kind of social order where men and women, slave and free, could live defined not by these cultural categories, but by their identity as children of God. And they didn't take their calling casually, but as a result, the rest of the world viewed them with suspicion, even hostility. But most painful of all, the members of Matthew's church were Jewish. They were Jewish followers of Jesus, and their faith in Jesus had caused division among the Jews. The folks in Matthew's church had either walked out or been kicked out of their synagogue. Friends and family they had one time been close to, shared life with, they were now divided. There had been a family fight that was deeply painful. And they were left to wonder, is this the way life is supposed to be? If Jesus really is the promised one of God, is life supposed to be like this? Do you ever feel that way? So Matthew, being a preacher, reminds them of a story that Jesus loved to tell. It's about farming again. Jesus wasn't a farmer, nor was his father. You would think Jesus would throw a story about carpentry in there at some point, but no. He tells lots of stories of seeds and soils and weeds. In this parable, Jesus says there was a wheat field, but weeds were found among the wheat. Now, for this sermon, we're going to skip past the enemy and the mystery, though one day we'll focus on that. We're going to jump right to the conversation about pulling the weeds. A good farmer never wanted weeds in with his wheat, just like our God Squad here at Derry doesn't want weeds in among our flowers. And the God Squad does an amazing job keeping our flower beds looking immaculate. Nancy Kitzmiller knows weeds don't belong in the garden, unless you're in the biblical garden out there where there's some dandelions, because it's mentioned in the Bible, and some people consider those weeds. Take that out. Weeds don't belong in a garden. Now, I hated pulling weeds as a kid. It was work, and I didn't want to do it. I tried to argue we should all respect all of God's creation and not indiscriminately destroy weeds just because they didn't fit our definition of beauty. It did not work, and I was still sent out with gloves and a trowel to pull the weeds. Now, I'm pretty sure I pulled up as many flowers as I did weeds. Do you pull the weeds? Now, Jesus sounds a bit like me when I was a kid, and for the record, no one has ever said that before. Now, all his stories are surprising. The first surprise is the laborers don't just pull the weeds, but first ask, "Is this what you want us to do?" Now, if they had just one afternoon with Nancy, they would know that weeds don't belong in the garden. Of course you pull them. But Jesus says, no. You better leave them alone until the harvest. If you pull those weeds now, you will do more harm than good. Kind of like me pulling the weeds at my old church and pulling up all the fancy tulips with them, or giving myself poison ivy. But this story isn't actually about farming. It's a story about the kingdom, how life is lived in God's promised day. I think Jesus is less focused on flower beds with this story and more focused on how we deal with the disappointments and injuries of life and the failings in the world. And what he teaches is that some weeds need to be pulled, but some weeds you need to leave alone and let God redeem what we cannot repair. Because sometimes, like a blue balloon, we can't fix it. Sometimes we need to leave alone and let God redeem what we cannot repair. Two stories. When I was in college, some friends of mine were in the midst of a bit of a prank war against each other, so I thought I would jump in and offer my services. So I gave my friends the brilliant idea of what I like to call car larding. It's where you get pure lard and you smear it all over a car and then wrap it in saran wrap. Now, it seems funny, and it kind of is, until you realize a car wash is not going to remove all of that fat. What we thought might be funny or harmless ended up being a bigger deal. Now, I would have liked to have abdicated all responsibility, make my other friends clean it up, or my friends who own the car deal with it. They got in this prank war in the first place. It's your own fault. But I knew I couldn't do that. So I went to clean up my friend's mess. My mess. I may not have physically done the damage, but I was part of it nonetheless. I had to use a plastic scraper and slowly scrape every bit of lard off the cars, and then we washed them. It took 2 days. Now, I could have pretended I had nothing to do with it, said it was their own fault for being in a prank war anyway, but that wasn't right. I did have something to do with it, and I had the power to make it better. Sometimes when you mess things up, you need to do whatever you can to make things right. Sometimes when things are going wrong in the world, we need to do everything we can to fix it, to make it right. Second story. In 1880, there were 3 men running for the Republican nomination for president: Ulysses S. Grant, James Blaine, and John Sherman. But the convention could not settle on any one of these. After days of voting, they elected a man on the 36th ballot who had not run and said he did not wish to be the nominee, James A. Garfield. He was only at the convention to give the nominating speech for Sherman. After refusing to run, Garfield was then elected the 20th president of the United States. 4 months into his presidency, he was shot. It was not a fatal wound, but it was a wound from which he would never recover. Dr. Willard Bliss treated the injured president. He was never able to find the bullet as it traveled across his body. But almost daily, with unsterilized instruments and his own unwashed fingers, Dr. Bliss probed the wound in search of the bullet. Several months after the shooting, Garfield died. An autopsy revealed that he died not of the gunshot, but of raging infection that no doubt was introduced to his body through Dr. Bliss's treatment. Dr. Bliss was no doubt attempting to help, but rather than help, he made things worse. The president ultimately died not because of the actions of his would-be assassin, but because of the care of his doctor. Sometimes, even when doing the best we know how, we can only make things worse. That's what Calvin means when he talks about total depravity. It doesn't mean we are totally horrible, but even at our best, with our best intentions, we can mess up. Even our best intentions can hurt others. Sometimes impact is greater than intent. We can think our words help, but they hurt. We can think the joke is funny, but it hurts. We can think the gesture is kind, but it's insulting. Sometimes it's better not to try and fix things. Sometimes our voice is not needed in a particular conversation. Sometimes we have to just trust that God will redeem, God will make it right in some promised day, God will repair that which we cannot fix. And the most important lesson is knowing the difference between the two. And that requires wisdom. It requires humility. I sat with Helen in the first church I served. I walked over to her house with my little dog named Hildy, and we sat together, and she sobbed. I knew she liked dogs and couldn't have one on her own, so I brought Hildy. I called her our deacon dog. She went on a lot of deacon visits with me. Remembering my hospital chaplaincy blunder, I just sat quietly. I held her hand and handed her tissues. She had just told her son no more. She had been sending him money every week, but his problems were never solved. They were actually getting worse. He was in more debt, not less. She had been giving him money to help, but now she realized she might have just been enabling his addictions. There was no one in the world who wanted to help her son more than his mother. But in the way of things that certainly didn't seem fair to her wanting to help had no bearing on her being effective in helping. She realized he would need to find help elsewhere. The best way she could help was to no longer help, and it broke her heart. The gardens of our lives are filled with weeds, and we need to know when to weed and when to leave them alone. The laborers were wise. They knew to go to the farmer and ask, is this something you want us to fix? Or is this something we must leave in your hands? It's hard to trust God with the broken pieces of our lives. It's so hard. When we are so sure the weeds don't belong, when we believe we can pull them out and make things better. But we have to be honest and know that sometimes when we pull the weeds, we may pull the flowers, and that some weeds don't need to be pulled. It's hard not to help, hard not to try to fix it, and yet also not to use it as an excuse to then never go outside with gloves and trowel and say, well, I don't want to ever try to help anything, I'll just make it worse. That's one end extreme. Might as well not help. The other end is I can solve everything, even those things I really know nothing about. And that's tough. But we can learn from these laborers. Every day we too should ask God when to weed. What is ours to do, and what must we leave for you? What do you want us to take on, and what do you want us to give up? It takes strength and courage, honesty and humility, wisdom and patience. But this is how we live toward that promised day when God will make right everything we have failed to make right. Nothing is hopeless. We just have to learn when to weed and have the courage and the strength to sometimes use restraint and say, that's not mine to fix. That's not my conversation to jump in. Sometimes we can make it better. Sometimes we can't. But in the end, God will make all manner of things well. and all shall be well. And our trust is in that. And so we come to this meal in that faith, in that trust that God so loved the world, that God sent God's only Son, who lived and died and was raised again to new life and showed us what love and healing love looks like. And that is demonstrated in this table, where all are welcome to participate and to eat together. A picture, a foretaste of what the kingdom of heaven should look like and should be, where everyone is treated the same, where everyone is welcome, where everyone is nourished and fed, where everyone is loved.